the role of land value capture in delivering the urban extensions that we want to see happen across the country. And I've got my colleague and author of the report, Maurice Lange, with me. He's going to take us through some slides in the same ways he did last week when we focused on public house building. Maurice will take about 20 minutes, give or take, to run through some of the detail. It's not all of the detail. All of the detail is in the report. You can get that on our website, centreforcities.org. And we should have at least a little bit of time towards the end before we finish at 10:30 for some questions. If you've got anything that's burning, pop it in the Q&A, and I'll try to get through as many as we possibly can. But without further ado, Maurice, over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen and start the presentation. There we go. All right. So this presentation is going to be in roughly 3 parts. First, we're going to go through sort of setting the scene and a bit of the boring stuff around what actually is land value capture and what has the government been saying, why is it interesting in this moment. Secondly, I'm going to talk you through the spatial analysis we've been doing to sort of locate suitable locations for urban extensions and new towns. And then thirdly, and most of this presentation will be the results of our land value capture modelling. Think about how much is possible, where it is possible, and discuss sort of how changing different parameters in the model influences the outcomes. So to start, what actually is land value capture? So the amount that land is worth on an open market can change for a number of reasons. It can change because you get planning permission changes. So let's say it changes from being allowed to be an agricultural field to allowed to be a residential development. The land becomes much more valuable. And that's the type of change that we're going to be mostly focusing on in this report, and the type we'll be discussing today. So when that land value changes, whoever owns that land is the windfall beneficiary of an increase in wealth or income. And so what land value capture is the securing of all or some of this windfall change in value for the public benefit. So if the land is owned by the public, then sort of the change in land price automatically accrues to the public. But if it's privately owned, then you need some kind of intervention to secure the land value capture. So roughly, very simply, how do we do this in the UK at the moment? The main way that this happens is through Section 106 agreements. That is when the developer and the planning authority come to an agreement about what public benefits in kind or in cash will be delivered as part of getting that development done, and therefore as a condition of getting planning permission for that development. We also have a thing called the Community Infrastructure Levy, which is a fixed local charge per square metre on development. And we also do have already some public land assembly by development corporations and local authorities, where the public authority might buy the land, prepare it and master plan it, and then sell it, capturing the change in values between the point that they bought it and they sold it. The report goes into much more detail on these and a range of other mechanisms that you can use to capture land values. So if you're interested, take a look. And then, so why is land value capture particularly relevant today? So the government has been talking about 2 new initiatives which are relevant to land value capture. The first is new towns. So this, in the past, new towns were done via wide-scale public land assembly, and we would anticipate that at least some of them, or the larger scale projects, would pursue that kind of a model again using development corporations. And then secondly, in the National Planning Policy Framework consultation that happened in September, there was a proposal to set golden rules for any grey belt development. So this would be green belt development, and you would set expectations for landowners and private developers about the price land would be bought for and what would then be delivered on that land. So I hope that gives a kind of setting for what this report has been trying to speak to. So let's get into it. Where should we put the new towns or urban extensions? So we kind of developed a set of principles, and then we enacted those principles, and then what you get is the map on the right. Again, it's a little bit difficult to see because it's a whole map of England and the amount of land identified is quite small. But the principles upon which this is built is that there should be a city focus. We should be not just building developments in the middle of nowhere because that's where it might be easiest to build, but we should be growing urban economies where there are jobs to be and there's access to jobs, and where agglomeration economies would benefit from additional housing. And then secondly, these should be reliant on public transport. So we have drawn circles around train stations within a commuting distance of 15 largest cities. And those are the basis of the circles in that map. But then we don't just say any land and that could be developed. We remove types of land which are not developable. So natural areas, nature reserves, sites of special scientific interest, for example. We remove any heritage designations or conservation areas or areas of natural beauty. And we remove any inappropriate land types. So you can't build a house on hard rock and you can't build it in a flood zone, for example. And so this ends up with space for about 5 million homes to be built across the country. It's a nice round number that came out of the model, not the one that we were aiming for. So if we're talking about clearing the backlog of 4.3 million homes, there's space to do so within the land that we've identified. So before we get into the land value capture stuff, it's important to understand that everything that we talk about after this point is predicated on a different approach to the green belt. This is because taking our sort of sensible public transport oriented approach to identifying urban extension locations, we find that a lot of the land is in the green belt. I didn't really set out for this paper to be one about the green belt, but the green belt is so relevant to whether or not these things are possible. For example, if you look at the map on the left, that shows the London green belt in purple, and then our sort of potential urban extension locations in green, and then the current Greater London Authority boundaries. And so you can see 88% of the land that we've identified around London as suitable for development is currently stopped by the green belt. That doesn't mean that developing these would erode the green belt. You'd still have 93% of the London green belt back after you did all of this development, space for 1.4 million homes. And as you can see on the graph on the right, this broadly plays out across the country. Greenbelt stops any of these developments happening in sensible locations, but developing them doesn't erode the majority or even close to it of the greenbelt in those places. So this is one major finding in the report. The greenbelt is a major impediment to putting new towns or urban extensions in what we think are the most sensible locations. So if we set aside the green belt, how much land value capture can we get and where can we get it? So firstly, I'll talk to you a little bit about the model and how we sort of estimate potential land value capture. So our model is quite simple. On the left, we look at the potential revenues on a site. How much would you get if you built some houses in this place and you sold them at the going market rate? And that varies across the country. You can read in the report exactly how we calculate those, but they vary by local authority. Then in the middle, you have all of the costs that you might incur in having to build those houses. So the cost of building the houses directly, but then also all of the other infrastructure costs required, the cost of buying the land, the cost of master planning, doing the architecture, etc. The key thing, and then once you take your sale value, you take your costs, and then at the difference is your potential land value capture. The key thing that our model assumes is that you are able to fix the land cost. So normally in a free market, you would expect that the land value would go up and down in accordance with the sale price of the thing that you can buy it for. But if we're talking about land value capture, what we're trying to do is hold your land price at a lower level so that that windfall doesn't just go to the landowner, but some of it at least can go to the public. This might be through public land assembly, or it might be through placing obligations on the developer of the land. So the results that I'll show you until we discuss land prices later on are all assuming that you're buying this land for 5 times what it is worth agricultural price. So it's about 150,000 per hectare. So what are the results looking like? So the total amount of land value capture that you could get is enormous. If you add up all of the green on the map, or on the chart on the right, you get to about 190 billion pounds. And assuming that these would take about 30 years to develop, that's about 6 billion pounds a year over the course of 30 years. But as you can see, the geography of this is stark. So if you look at the map, it's a bit difficult to see again, but the pink locations are all places where the costs are greater than the value of the houses that you build in those places. Anything in blue is where there is potential land value capture, and the darker the blue, the more land value capture you can get in those places. And switching back to the chart on the right, again, it's quite clear that the Greater South East is our greatest source of potential land value capture. London represents 29% of the land that we've identified, but it's 82% of the potential land value capture. And the key reason that this is the case is because costs, assuming you can hold that land price down, vary a lot less than the revenues, so your house prices. House prices are much higher in the Greater South East than they are on average on the outskirts of Manchester, for example. And that means that if you're pursuing urban extensions, how much land value capture you can get into each place varies considerably. So what happens if you change? So I'm going to talk you through now sort of a series of changes to the parameters in the model. What happens if you change one thing, another thing? How much land value capture do you get? What comes out? So in the previous slide, we assumed that we bought the land for 5 times agricultural price. What happens to the amount of land value capture you can get in any given place if you increase that to 20 times, which is the light purple bars, or to 40 times, which is the dark purple bars? So in the places on the right, Manchester, Newcastle, you didn't get anything anyway, so there's no change. But in places which are most marginal, so those places with an amount of land value capture, but not lots, changing the land price matters loads. So in Oxford, if you move from 5 times to 40 times agricultural price, you lose all of the potential land value capture you could have in that place. Whereas if you're looking at the higher value places, obviously it matters less. In London, you lose about 20% of the potential land value capture if you increase from 5 to 40 times. So the reason that this matters is because you could assemble all of this land using compulsory purchase powers. In the public interest, you can hold land values quite low, but the landowner might protest, you might get caught in a court battle. So the developing authority might want to make a kind of compromise and say, well, we want this development to happen more than we want to be stuck in court battles for X number of years. So maybe we'll pay a bit more. And what this modeling shows is that where that threshold is matters to a differing extent in different places. Okay, so the second variable we can talk about is the density of developments. Now, you might think if you were adding an extra house, you can just add stuff to both your cost side and your revenue side, such that it might be a one-for-one relationship with increasing density and increasing land value capture. And what this slightly complicated chart shows you is that is not the case. So obviously, when you increase your densities, we've got 3 scenarios, we've got 35 houses per hectare, 55 and 75, the number of houses goes up, and the number of potential social homes you could cross-subsidize in these scenarios also goes up, and that's your green bars. But your total land value capture doesn't necessarily go up in the same way. That's the purple line, which looks at the axis on the right. And this is because when you build at higher densities, you have to include a higher number of apartments versus houses. And generally, houses cost less to build than apartments in the UK. It's not necessarily the case in other countries, but the UK, it's expensive to build apartments generally. And then apartments also sell for less money than your average house. So what you get is a narrowing of that margin between the potential costs and the potential revenues you get from these things, such that increasing your densities doesn't necessarily increase the amount of land value capture. And so we think it is a good thing to increase and encourage densities, especially in cities and especially near to train stations, so that you make the best use of land, and you can also encourage public transport use. But in those marginal locations, it might be that that renders the project surplus generating to deficit producing, and that will require subsidy to achieve. And this is also one of the reasons that in private developments, even though you could build more houses, it doesn't necessarily make sense, line up the incentives for private developers to develop at higher densities also doesn't necessarily line up. And we'll come back to sort of discussing densities again in a second. Actually, no, right now. So, one of the things we've done in this report is try and put these findings in the context of what the government's been talking about. And their golden rules for Greenbelt include a couple of things. One of them is a certain proportion of houses built on the Greenbelt being affordable homes. And so this is our model running on an affordable homes requirement at different percentages. So let's say you require developments to have 20% or 50% or 80% affordable housing. How many of these places remain viable? And then therefore, how many affordable homes do you get? And so the total homes that you get with different density scenarios and different affordability requirements is shown by the bars. So as you increase your affordability requirement, fewer places become viable because you have to spend your surplus cross-subsidizing social housing. But up to about 40%, that drop-off isn't too significant. But then after 40%, 50%, the total number of homes that you deliver really drops off. And then the other thing is if your main focus is how many affordable homes can be built, not just total homes, that's shown by the line. And that obviously increases with the affordability requirement up to a certain point where it then starts to go down again because you're not building anywhere near as many homes, you're not developing as many sites. So even if you were developing 80% affordable homes, because you've developed fewer sites, then you get fewer affordable homes than you would have done had you asked them to do 40% affordable housing, for example. So this just sort of helps think through some of those trade-offs and whether or not you might want to put different affordability requirements in different places to keep some places viable and some places not. And then this slide, it talks about the other thing that they talk about in their golden rules for the Greenbelt, which is assessing benchmark land prices. So let's assume that you've gone for your 50% affordable housing requirement. And if you set your benchmark land prices at different prices, how many places would be, how many homes would you get? How many places would remain viable? You see a drop-off in viability, the higher that land price will be, and a drop-off in the amount of affordable homes delivered as a result. So finally, the final thing I'm going to talk about before you can ask me some questions is the area across which you would distribute the land value capture, the windfall that you've managed to capture. So I construct kind of three different scenarios here. On the left, you have site-specific. So of those 160 blobs on the map that I've located, if you just kept the windfalls internally to those, how many houses would you get? How many affordable homes could you produce? And then what would the surplus per home be? And surplus per home is interesting because that is kind of like the intensity of the benefit to that specific location and any given person who's moving into that place. So on the left is site-specific. In the middle is sharing it citywide. So you have, let's say, a development corporation which manages across different sites. It will balance the ones which generate more with the ones that balance less. What would you get? And then the one on the right is a kind of more extreme scenario where you've shared it all across the country and that you're using your surplus generating sites to cross-subsidize your deficit producing sites. And so the key things to find in this chart are, if you do redistribute from a local or a citywide to a national, you get way more homes built. And if that's your priority, then that's something that would make sense to do. But the trade-off in that scenario is that the amount of surplus that you get per home built across the country falls quite considerably. So that the amount of land value capture, the amount of money that you have to invest in other things like transport or environmental improvements, for example, falls away. And so in the more local scenarios, it might be better to keep those things local. And you can then increase the intensity of the land value capture put in that place for the public benefit. I'm going to skip on through, and you can see all the rest of this in the report just because I realize I'm running over on time a little bit. But so what are the key lessons? Location matters a lot in terms of land value capture. If you're going to rely on land value capture to fund things, then there are only certain places that you can do this. And then there are all sorts of other questions about what you expect from sites, which involve trade-offs, but these are mostly secondary to the geography point, but they are relevant in all places. And finally, sort of land value capture matters a lot. That amount of money that you could generate is huge. But if you want to be hitting your affordable housing targets, our modelling, as you can see in the paper, doesn't suggest that you'll be able to do all of it via land value capture. And it's also a limiting thing to rely on land value capture to do it because of the geography point. And so what are our kind of policy recommendations coming out at the end of the report? So urban extension should be pursued. We are pro doing this, but it makes most sense to focus on the Greater Southeast because that is where housing issues are greatest, which is what then gives you the greatest potential for land value capture. Then we need to have a big rethink about the green belt, and we need to plan for the redesignation of it for development around public transport nodes. And then to capture land value uplifts most effectively, we need a more widespread use of public land assembly, which will involve investing in the ability of planning authorities to use compulsory purchase, or at least threaten the use of it, such that the expectation about land prices goes down. And this might best be done through a citywide development corporation, which would allow a balance of sharing of revenues between sites, but also concentrate the benefits of land value capture in a more local manner than redistributing it across the whole country would. All right. Thank you very much. I've had to whiz through the end there a bit, but I encourage you all to read the report. It's on the Centre for Cities website.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Maurice. So, as I said, this is the third report that we've had out in the last week, looking at different aspects of the housing situation in the UK. And each of them is looking at different aspects. We recognise, as I've said before, that they are related. And in some respects, to get the full picture of where we think we are and what needs to be done, you need to read all three of them, or at least look at all three of them to understand how they work together and work off each other. So that's an important point for me to make on that. We've had several questions, particularly, but not exclusively. So Andrew Turner asks a question about assumptions and housing mix. Sue James asks a bunch of questions on some of the assumptions in the model. I'm not going to get you to answer those, Maurice, because I feel confident that all of them, if not completely, to a significant degree, are dealt with in the report. So if you want the detail on the specific questions that you've posed, you need to look at the report and particularly look at the way that the model has been constructed. It's not perfect. We highlight some of the limitations. All models are imperfect in different ways, but the detail on the assumptions that we make are very clearly articulated, I think. And then my final point, which is a real kind of important point that Maurice made right at the outset, applies more generally. If we want to do urban extensions, which we think we should, then we have to think very clearly and be bold, if you're the government, particularly on land use and particularly as it relates to the green belt. You can't do urban extensions and use land value capture to fund quite a lot of the related and associated infrastructure, however defined, transport, community facilities, social housing, if you don't engage more deeply in questions about the green belt, which will need to go beyond where we think we are with the grey belt as well. You can do it through other means and you can do other things, but if you want LVC to do quite a bit of the heavy lifting in terms of the urban extension agenda and new towns agenda, then greenbelt questions are going to be front and centre to that. And as Maurice has said, and get you to say a little bit, just double down on this, Maurice, the government's going to think seriously about the price of land that it sets, and then the price of land that it wants to see happen, and the procedures upon which it's going to do that. So I think those just things are worth doubly stressing, Maurice. And if you add something on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up very well, Andrew. If we got yeah, I think it's clear from the report that I think what we did was so you said you're going to do urban extensions. What the Greenbelt is an urban containment mechanism. And so it doesn't make sense to consider your urban containment mechanism alongside your urban growth sort of thing. And so if you're going to take a sensible approach like we have, and you can read sort of full list of how we've done that in the report, you've got to think about public transport, you've got to think about urban density, you've got to think about all of those other things. And then the extent to which that then butts up against the Greenbelt was surprising. Not surprising to me, but it was new, and I think it's really important that we engage in sort of a discussion about how you can plan for urban extensions in a sensible way which captures those uplifts.
Yeah, let's take this a couple of questions, because in part they relate to if you look at this report in isolation, you can conclude some of the points, but if you look at the other two that we've done, I think they begin to answer. So both Michael Edwards, hello Michael, and Duncan Laird ask a real question, which is, what's the geographical scope of LVC? You've talked a little bit about that. It obviously is significant in the Greater Southeast, but not exclusively so. And if you only focus on the Greater Southeast, do you then exacerbate inequalities, however you define those? Because by definition, you're doing more in a place that is already doing relatively well. So LVC scope, but then inequality, which touches on the private and the public papers that we've also looked at, and more broadly, how we think about the economic potential of our big cities.
Yeah, I guess so. The land value capture sort of modeling that we've done is entirely dependent on the price of market rate housing. So where house prices are high enough in suburban locations, then you have scope for land value capture, and that is for as long as we have an undersupply of houses in the Greater Southeast, it's going to be that the geography misaligns in that way. If you're talking about sort of regional inequalities, I think what this points towards is if maybe it's not the priority when it comes to housing or urban development for us to go for a large new town on the outskirts of Manchester, for example, because other new builds in those same locations don't sell for very much money. You could subsidize those developments and make places in those places, but money might be better spent trying to develop the economy of the existing city inside of its existing boundaries. And as we've talked about a bit in the public paper, that could be through public land assembly and helping brownfield sites and increasing densities within those cities, rather than encouraging their growth on the outskirts. It's not quite ever going to be as simple as that in reality, but it's not. So it's where you've got your housing bottlenecks that you have the greatest potential for land value capture, which is then reflected in house prices. Over time, this might augment. You would hope, change if you pursued fastest housing growth where you had greatest potential for land value capture. You would get hopefully less scope for land value capture because prices would have come down.
Yeah, that's great. So it's 10:30, so we need to finish. So as I say, quite a lot of the questions are about detail. They're definitely in the report, particularly in the model explanation. And obviously you can get the 3 reports, plus you can get the slides from each of the presentations that we've done, plus the video of each of the 3 events that we've put on to at least provide an initial explainer on the 3 reports. All of that is available on our website, centreforcities.org. Have a look, come back and tell us what we've got right, what we've got wrong. As I said, this is the 3rd of 3, so this concludes the trilogy of reports. We've got one more housing related event, which is a housing reception on Thursday, this Thursday, so the 12th, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the House of Commons, where we're going to be Again, just gathering in a slightly more social, informal environment, but nevertheless still focused on housing. If you're able to come, it would be fantastic to see you. Again, details on our website. But until the next time, take care.